we'll leave you to plan your answer to that. What I'd like to do is to try and bring in as many questions as possible. We've got about half an hour. You're all invited for something to eat. Not very much to eat, probably some crisps. I didn't want to sound like it was a dinner. It's like some bits of food.
Sandwiches. Yeah.
And
this is micro.
And some wine.
Oh, yeah.
I think there is wine though.
Wine,
There
I
is wine.
understand, yeah.
So we can definitely continue the conversation afterwards. We've got about half an hour now. So if anyone would like to start off. Yes. And there's a microphone.
Hi. Hello. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. My name is Julio Davila, and I teach at University College London. And I've been coordinating a research on Medellin's metro cables, which Milford mentioned, and ski lifts. I prefer the term aerial cable cars because ski lifts make them sound something like for fun, and they're not for fun. They actually serve a very interesting purpose. And actually, I find this very, very interesting and very appropriate for the research we're doing. And Milford and I have been exchanging emails about all this stuff. But I just wanted to comment on a couple of things. The first one that in terms of that intervention that Milford and to some extent Kate talked about in Comunas 1 and 2, which is Comunas Nororientales, Comuna Oriental, which involve the aerial cable car plus quite a lot of urban upgrading. What we're finding in our research is that the cable car has significant symbolic value in the sense of having incorporated areas which were excluded from the city symbolically and physically, and even though they're very close to the city center and not too far from the metro system, into the city. So there's a physical inclusion, but limited in that the first line can only carry 30,000 people a day. But it's more symbolic in the sense that it's saying to these areas, yes, you're part of Medellin. And that's a very interesting thing that we're finding. But the other one, which is slightly more negative, well, not more negative, but complementary, is that the intervention that has gone in terms of upgrading of all these areas is much more important than the transport links. So just to give you some figures, depending on what exchange rate you use, but the cable car, that first line out of 2 that have been built so far, cost about $32 million to build. Not counting, obviously, the maintenance and so on. But energy is relatively cheap, and they're very energy efficient. But the investment in urban upgrading up to December 2010 was $225 million. So it's nearly 10 times as much. So, and there's an enormous difference between the two and how that's affecting the poor or the livelihoods of the poor locally. And we find that, one of the conclusions we're probably heading towards is that, an investment in something like that, which is largely symbolic, is very valuable in its own right, but it has to come with other things. But that drawback of that, which is true of the metro, and you talked about Cultura E, but you didn't talk about Cultura Metro, which is another very interesting top-down issue in its own right, which merits all sorts of research, is that people cannot carry any loads into the system. So that immediately excludes certain kinds of entrepreneurship or micro, small-scale entrepreneurship, because it means you can't take your raw materials, inputs and so on into the whole system. The second point, which to some extent,
Don't take too long, Julio, because I want.
I know,
sure
but very quickly, to speak to what Mauricio was saying and Alan was saying about whether it's left and right, is the issue of whether Fajardo is left or right wing. I was very skeptical also about all these things, but in our research, Alan, what we found is that what is very interesting, and it's very deep-seated into the communities now, is presupuesto participativo, is the participatory budgeting that Fajardo introduced and Salazar has continued. It may finish, or it will finish, no doubt, if, say, Luis Perez comes into power again, who is the high guy who sort of set up the first aerial cable car. But what it has done, participatory budgeting, is undermine the old clientelistic system of the Juntas de Acción Comunal. And we've got plenty of evidence from talking to people there, individually and in focus groups. And that's, regardless of whether it's left wing or right wing, it is a different way of doing things, and one that is much less clientelistic, and that's quite interesting.
Thank you very much. Yes.
My name's Matthew Richmond. I'm a livelihoods researcher at YCare International. Also hoping to start a PhD in Kate's department later in the year, so I'll come and speak to you later. I lived in Bogota for a year and was really inspired by the example by the Transmilenio, which had been extended to the far southern part of the city, which was, which is obviously most deprived part, and worked in a place called Usme, which is right on the periphery of Bogota, and was able to travel every day from my apartment in the kind of middle class northern zone in quite quick time, which I imagine a couple of years earlier wouldn't have been possible. So I found that really inspiring, and felt the same way about the Metro Cable in Medellin. And that the way that it kind of symbolically opened up that that space that previously had been kind of off the map for most for the formal city, and suddenly was accepted and had become part of the city. What my question is which I was going to put to the panel, but the professor here might actually also be able to comment on, is from a more kind of conventional economic development approach, are there any knock-on effects, multiplier effects of opening up those areas to in theory the markets of the city as a whole and of the developed areas? Can we quantify the impact in terms of jobs created, in terms of micro enterprise? Have there been studies yet that show divergences between those areas and similar areas, but maybe that haven't yet become kind of integrated into the city? Because obviously, if you can do that, then you can make a stronger business case for why extending these networks is so important. For me, the symbolic and the kind of psychological importance of them is enough in itself, but it's not going to be for mayors and governments.
That's a very good question, Matthew. And I mean, actually, the ambassador may or may not want to tell us his views about the proposed metro in Bogota. Yeah. But the negative side is that with a very restrained budget, you do have to make the case beyond, over and above the kind of feel-good factor, let's say, and which is a flippant way of putting it. It's much more than that. Yeah. I agree. Any other comments or questions? Jonathan, would you mind passing that over? Sorry.
Jonathan Mitchell, ODI. Very interesting. Thank you very much. I wanted to return to the question at the top of your background note, which is this a post-Washington consensus approach to local economic development? Because what I've heard is fascinating and very sensible, I think. That you should separate social and economic objectives, and that you shouldn't just focus on small scale and micro enterprise and the informal sector. That you should look at some competitive small business, and that enterprise should respond to the needs of the market. I'm wondering how much is this a challenge to the Washington consensus, and how much is it not really just very sensible management of an urban area? And Michael Porter, I think, would be delighted by this. I don't think he'd be worried at all. And I don't think that means it's a bad thing at all. And actually what seems to be coming out is, I think, if you strip away the ideology, some really sensible, mainstream local economic development.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think I would like to ask the panelists in their responses to really focus on that issue of economic development. So I think we've talked about the cultural impacts of good urban management, and they're clearly very important, and everyone in those cities is quite clearly quite proud of the various things that have gone on in that sphere. But my question, which is linked to what Jonathan said, and I asked it earlier, is has it led to jobs? Has it actually led to poverty reduction? And those are, I think that's where I think Milford and Kate are getting at with regard to whether or not it's a challenge to the conventional wisdom on whether or not that's neoliberalism or not. Louise. Sorry, it's got a long way to come. Sorry, can I just say also, we do have Colombians, I think, watching this, so I'd very much invite you to send Malcolm a comment online if you want to, or a question.
I mean, I was quite interested, or am quite interested, if the panel could tease out something that you referred to, which was when talking about micro enterprises and the barriers, you referred to the fact that people didn't have money in order to really buy products from them. So therefore, by creating more and more micro industries in areas where there was very little money, is a big issue. When you look at Colombia, structurally, the inequality is horrendous there. And I'm just wondering how much you think that you actually have to tackle first this structural inequality that exists within Colombia before you can actually begin to see micro industry actually flourishing. Because I'm just wondering what the relationship you think is between those sorts of things. I mean, if you were to, I mean, I don't know the most recent figures, but I know over between 2005 and 8, you saw GDP double, FDI triple, but you saw poverty get about 4 points better, but abject poverty increased by about 2 point something. So you could see that the inequality was getting worse, and at that time, Colombia was the 5th most unequal country in the world. So how does all of this kind of play into getting microfinancing projects off the ground?
That's a very good question. Any others, or should we go back to the panel? We've got about 20 minutes. So maybe we'll take some reflections, and then maybe we'll have another time for another round. So should we go backwards then? If Ambassador, do you want to start? So if just take a couple of minutes.
Yeah, very quickly about the how to create wealth in these poor neighborhoods. I agree it's not going to be through microfinance. That's not the solution, even though I think it has a partial contribution to make. I think that Colombia has to do two things. Work on a strategy, private-public strategy on import substitution as a possibility to generate a production of goods and services and pay wages and salaries to people so that they have a purchasing capacity. I think Colombia is importing a lot of stuff that can be produced locally. And if there's a good strategic plan, work together between private and public sector, we could have an opportunity for growth, for jobs, for taxes, etc. And, of course, free trade agreements. And I know that that word is not very popular amongst some of the persons present here, but I am personally convinced of the benefits of a free trade agreement. And that's why we are working very hard to try to ensure the free trade agreement with the US and with the European Union, and more free trade agreements, because we do believe that Colombia will benefit from trade, because we think that Colombian entrepreneurs, the Colombian economy can be competitive. Of course, some entrepreneurs, some business, some regions might suffer of the opening of the economy, but other regions, other entrepreneurs, other business will flourish. And I would be very happy if the Colombian entrepreneurs could sell without duties and taxes and limitations to the European market, to the American market, where we have millions and millions of consumers with a very high purchasing capacity. I think I'm personally convinced, and I have studied this as an economist for many, many years, that the net impact of free trade agreements for Colombia would be very positive. And just a comment, yeah.
Yeah, well, just a quick question, because your comments on free trade agreements I don't think will necessarily be a surprise, but your comments on import substitution might be. I don't remember reading that in the Colombian economic policy for the next 10 years.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. There's no plan, and I think there should be a plan. And I think that deserves discussion. And I think, for example, going back to the case of Pro Antioquia, that's a perfect case in which Pro Antioquia could work with the local entrepreneurs and say, okay, we are importing all this stuff from wherever. Let's see what can we produce here. And let's try to plant some money in these new companies, and let's teach these young entrepreneurs to develop quality products. And let's commit ourselves to buy those products for X number of years under certain conditions, of course. This has to be very, very well crafted. This is not just a socialist intervention and increasing the duties for imports and those kind of interventions. No, this is a new model, a pragmatic model, very entrepreneurial, in which you can find opportunities. I think there are plenty of opportunities there, and you're right. There's nothing about that on the national plan or even regional plans. But I personally believe that there's an opportunity. And I just want to quickly comment about the metro decision. And to confuse all of you, that after saying that I'm in favor of free trade, you will think that I'm a neoliberal, Washington consensus guy, etc., etc. And what I'm going to say, and so most of you will probably believe that I am very much in favor of a metro for Bogota. And I will surprise all of you by saying that I am the #1 opponent of a metro in Bogota. After Peñalosa, yeah. Because I think it's ridiculous for Bogota to spend $3 billion in a solution that has a lot of limitations, and that a solution that can be, for transport, for public transport in Bogota, that can be properly taken care of by Transmilenio. Transmilenio has been a very successful model developed by Peñalosa, by Colombia, based on Curitiba, on the Curitiba experience. Transmilenio is a model that has been studied in 80 countries in the world. Peñalosa has traveled the world 20 times in the past 5 years, advising governments of everywhere in this solution. And now we have the solution, and now we're going to pay 6 times more, which is the cost of a metro, 6 times more to have, just because we need to have a metro, because we are a modern city and we need to have, and if London has a metro and Medellin has a metro, why not Bogota? No, Bogota, of course not. $3 billion. I mean, what can we do with $3 billion? In Bogota, we have 1 million inhabitants still living in extreme poverty. And what are we going to tell them about our priorities if we decide to invest $3 billion to mobilize only 4% of the population? And when we have an alternative solution as Transmilenio, which is extremely efficient and costs a fraction of what a metro costs.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Gilbert.
Okay. May I get in line after Enrique Peñalosa and the Ambassador as anti-metro? I don't count as much, but I am in print in opposing it. Although I would, when I talked to the mayor of Quito a month and a half ago, who's also building a metro, and I said to him, well, what about opportunity cost? You could spend all this money on education and health. He said, but we wouldn't do that. If we don't spend it on the metro, we won't spend it on anything else. And there's a certain logic. There's a certain logic there, which I have. Social urbanism. What the ambassador said about that is fine. What worries me about what has happened both in Bogota and in Medellin recently is whether it's sustainable. Because while most people outside Colombia recognize what Fajardo, Mocus, Peñalosa, Jaime Castro, who's never mentioned in this context and ought to be, what they achieved, what did the electorate of Bogota do? They voted against Enrique Peñalosa and voted in first Lucho and then Samuel Moreno. So we cannot assume that there is a recognition among the poor that these social urbanizers have actually helped the poor. And I think Enrique Peñalosa recognizes that he failed in selling the message. He didn't, sell it enough that the Transmilenio, the libraries, and even more, the infrastructure programs will actually help the poor. The other thing that's worrying is that urbanization was recognized a long time ago by Lachlan Curry, Canadian, US, and later lived in Colombia, as a wonderful source for generating money to put in infrastructure and potentially to improve the distribution of income. The wealth that has been created through property values going up in Medellin and Bogota is enormous, but it's not been taxed. And if you taxed it at a sensible level, you could have finished infrastructure, you could have finished Transmilenio system, even built a metro with the money very easily. But they could not do that. I'm sure Enrique Peñalosa, Antanas Mocos, Sergio Fajardo all wanted to raise taxes. To some extent they did, the sobretasa on gasolina, but they couldn't because of the opposition they would have received. And that's a major, because as we all accept, I think in this audience, inequality is a huge problem. And unless you raise the average income of the bottom 20%, micro-enterprise hasn't got a chance.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely critical. Post-Washington consensus, I don't think that most Latin American countries have ever properly followed the Washington consensus. Some did. Well, Chile preceded the Washington consensus. It was anyway should be called the Chicago consensus, not the Washington consensus. Brazil didn't. Brazil, I think, reneged on 5 IMF agreements, so that isn't Washington consensus. Argentina backed out. If you're a big country in Latin America or China or India, you can say boo to the World Bank and the IMF because they need you more than the countries need those institutions. So I think if you look at Venezuela, when did Venezuela, apart from 1989, when did Venezuela ever try to follow the rules of the IMF? Never. When did Bolivia really try? Well, they did in dribs and drabs, but not generally. So I don't think there was a strong effort in most countries to follow the Washington consensus, and they're still vaguely following it anyway, because some of it actually does make sense. Cut budget deficits, not Osborne style, but you need to cut deficits. You need to have a realistic foreign exchange rate. You don't want unprofitable, incompetent public enterprises, etc., etc. So I'm not as against, and I've got a paper on the water company in Bogota, which to me has sort of gone in between. It's taken some bits of the Washington consensus and some bits of social urbanism, and has been relatively successful. Clientelism. Sergio Fajardo's participatory budgeting has helped finish off clientelism, but he was only elected along with Jaime Castro, Mocos, Peñalosa to be mayor because of the decline of clientelism and the demise of the traditional parties in Colombia. So we can thank the 1991 Constitution for their arrival, and good for them for continuing to undermine clientelism. But, of course, the great accusation against Samuel Moreno, apart from corruption, which may or may not be justified, is that he's brought back clientelism in Bogota. So one of the big problems about all this progress is it's so easily reversed. Now, I actually don't think, maybe I was influenced. He was very nice to me and talked to me for an hour and a half and gave me a nice book a month ago. But I actually think he's going to come out of this whole thing, assuming he is innocent of corruption. Assuming that, I think he's going to come out rather better. And this is what he's banking on. He keeps citing that Enrique Peñalosa was terribly unpopular just before he ended his mayorship. No, well, in the middle with the Bolados. And
and then he was very popular.
Yeah.
When
Well,
he left office, he had the 85%.
Well, Samuel thinks that when the Obras are finished, and when he leaves power, suddenly magically his ratings are going to shoot up, whether that's true or not. Anyway, I shut up now. But sorry, and one word we have not mentioned in all of this, which I think is terribly important, is China. What happens in Colombia is going to, and in Latin America generally, both positively and negatively, is China. And there was a book by Moravitz written, Why the Emperor's Clothes Are Not Made in Colombia. And the answer was because they're made in the Far East. And it nearly finished the textile industry in Medellin. China is incredibly important in all this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think, as I predicted, we've had the most fascinating and wide-ranging debate from metros to the Washington Consensus in Latin America. I'm not quite sure how you're going to kind of sum up your...
Yeah, no.
We've got about 10 minutes, so if you want to take about 5 minutes each, we start with Kate.
Do I need this, or have I got that?
I think you need to use that.
Okay. Frank Sinatra. Okay. Okay, well, that really was really fascinating questions that came out of that. And yeah, I mean, I think what I wanted to focus on was Louise's question at the end there, because I think that question brings in a lot of what other people were talking about as well, because I think you were talking about, by talking about inequality and micro-development and development at that level, really you're talking about inclusion in development. And microfinance is, yeah, it's seen as the way, it's talked of in terms of financial inclusion recently in a way that perhaps it wasn't before. And I think that the role that it could have is in, or ideally it could have, is in opening that gate between the informal and the formal economies in a sense, and recognise that, I think, as the ambassador was saying, that it does have a role. It doesn't have the role that it's been touted to have in terms of solving everything from patriarchal oppression to world peace or whatever it's been set up as. But it does have a role in addressing people's need to credit, quite simply, which is really there. And in facilitating not only credit but also savings, then it can begin to address the question of vulnerability and social protection in that sector that will, in the informal economy, that will continue to exist necessarily. However, the role that it has been overblown. I think that's what's welcome with the shift from the focus on the informal economy, that I think did characterise the neoliberal period in a way. The change in focus from that to more formal, developing more formal enterprises that provide jobs can open the door to that. The other thing I was thinking of coming back on related to that is what Alan mentioned at the beginning, which seems to be talking about what counts as local, like whether or not people should be dealing with a local market. And I think that's a really, really interesting question. I think often it's underestimated the amount of competition that goes on in local barrios, and also as well as the resources that they have, in that it might not be acceptable to sell to your neighbour if you're dependent on that neighbour for any reason, or if you hate that neighbour for any reason. And of course there's an awful lot of politics in what goes on there. And it also plays into our idea of what counts as a community. And I thought it was really interesting that you also mentioned that universities don't sell each other's books. So there's that kind of community there that doesn't want to enter into any kind of collaborative relationship, and there's a lot of competition in that community too. So I think that tends to get underestimated, particularly with microcredit programs. And the reason it's important is if your limited resource is time, then you don't have time to travel to other markets. And that's why a lot of micro enterprises are kind of condemned to stay in the very local area and then come up against those kind of barriers and fail. And the other thing, like, just to kind of sum up, I do want to come back on the question, what about the men, that I got from Alan as well. Gosh, I do lose count in the number of times I get asked that. And I normally do a better job of covering it before I stop talking. I should have emphasised that, of course, men are also poor. Of course, men also have a bad time. Sometimes I've caused men to have a bad time, actually. But what I want to emphasise is while working class men, there are a variety of reasons why certain men are going to be poor in certain ways, why men will not be able to access those markets. Gender is not one of those reasons. Generally, if there's a gendered barrier against something, it's women that can't get over it. Yeah? And that's why, by focusing on those particular barriers, I want to illustrate how women can't access the economy. So I should have clarified that first, so thank you. And just very finally, I think the question about the post-Washington consensus is very interesting. You also hear post-neoliberalism a lot. I think post-neoliberalism tends to be used more in relation to the Bolivias, the Venezuelas that are really not neoliberal anymore, kind of thing. I think, like, the comments that have been made, like, we've come up against the dangers of that kind of apocalypse thinking, is that the use of post is that, we've got all these different kind of things and it's just not that, and then you go back and look at the that, and the that never was really that, if I'm making any sense at all. But I do think that phrase, post-Washington consensus or post-neoliberalism, is being used a lot, and it tends to be being used just to recognise that the gross inequalities that were caused, Bolivia, 1985, when structural adjustment did come in, there's a recognition that completely unreined in free market approach that, even if it didn't take off in reality, certainly framed the way that people understood what was happening. There's a reaction against that. And I find it very interesting maybe to compare, like, you mentioned like the participatory budgeting and like the kind of social urbanism that's happening in Colombia, to compare that with the kind of big society that I think is still neoliberal, like the big society that's happening here. Neoliberal as in making the social work for the economic. And I wonder I think there's a genuine, like, again, that question of can you characterize things as left and right? In Latin America, there's perhaps more of a genuine challenge to that than there is in Europe, and that's why that phrase is useful, in a sense.
Well, thanks very much, Kate. I just wanted to say I think we've reached a lot of kind of agreement, which is quite good in a debate on Colombia, because it's quite divisive, sometimes gets quite divisive. We all agree that there's a good metro in Medellin and there shouldn't be one in Bogota. But what I still don't quite get, which is at the point of your piece, is how do we get income, money, and presumably jobs in the poorest barrios in Medellin? So that that's what I really don't feel like we've got to yet. We've had import substitution from the ambassador, which is quite...
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I know it's difficult for you.
But that was a surprise.
Okay, I'll try and answer Jonathan's comment, but just a very quick one. What intrigued me about the Medellin experiment was that it was using various techniques and interventions which are historically more associated with neoliberalism than anything else. I mean, public ownership, strategic planning, all the public ownership of development agencies. These are things that we've always historically associated with the Washington Consensus, with neoliberalism. So I'm very heartened to find that, in a sense, those particular, what might have been seen as leftist type interventions are now moving to become more mainstream. Kate mentioned a good book that's just come out by the Inter-American Development Bank, The Age of Productivity. I mean, they're talking about issues of industrial policies, and it's now become mainstream. Now, 10 years ago, if you mentioned industrial policies at a World Bank meeting, you'd have been kicked out. Yeah, I mean, so things are moving back, and the sorts of things that Medellin is working with are, I take the pragmatic approach. I mean, if they work, you work with them, whether they were left, right, or whatever. I mean, Chile is the obvious example. I mean, it started out with a Chicago-style model, but one of the single biggest issues or boosts was the ownership of the world's biggest copper mine, which was a huge bonus to the treasury. Now, that was totally not Washington Consensus, but it was allowed because otherwise the model was going to collapse. So they said, okay, you know, use another type of model in order to try to prop up what the ideological model. So use a non-ideological type of intervention, in other words, to prop something up. They've conveniently forgotten all these other areas. Very good couple of articles on the sort of non-neoliberal foundations to Chile's supposed free market miracle. So I see this as very good, that we're moving into looking at strategic tools and instruments and techniques which 10 years ago would have been laughed at and now are becoming mainstream, and we're discussing them politely and we're looking at how we can improve them, how we can change them. So I see that as an element of progress. Going back just to what Alan said about the issue of the local market, and he raised the example of Marks and Spencer. I think Alan falls into something that we often talk about. It's called survivor bias. So he's looking at a particular example and then trying to trace back where it came from, as though you can learn lessons. Well, if you talk to somebody who says, you know, a rich guy, well, you know, what's your secret? Well, 20 years ago I went to a casino and I won £1 million. Okay, well, if we sort of extrapolate that, well, that's the way to become rich, then you just go to a casino. So you can't, from the one or two examples that become successful, it's not logical to extrapolate back to say, well, that's how you do it. The problem at the local economy level is that, as I said in my presentation, that poor communities don't have the demand to allow this idea that there's a constant extrusion of new enterprises undertaken by the poor, which will get them out of poverty. By definition, poverty is in that community, and that means that there's very little demand. So they have to move outside of the community, and they have to move, first of all, they have to move to the richer areas to start accessing demand there. But in many models, it's, if you work with the richer communities, it's basically simple consumption goods, babysitting services, sorts of things, which in a sense is a step forward. But the most successful models where micro enterprises have become small and medium are when they integrate into public spending flows. For example, the state, at the local or the national level, prioritizes micro enterprises or small enterprises to give them a stable source of demand. Maybe just to get them going, give them 5 years and then let them compete. But that gets them going, that gets them over the initial teething problems, and that gets them into operation. Or where you have initiatives like Pro Antioquia, where they say, look, we really want to help the small business sector, and we can do nothing better than giving them a starter contract, 5 years, mentoring, technical advice, and then after that, we will let the baby grow up. But that's the best thing that you can actually offer a micro enterprise if you want it to go into become a small, and then hopefully to become into a medium. So the fact that they've actually understood this idea, and they're making strides in important areas, I thought was very good. So I think that's where the future lies. The issue of relocalizing some elements of demand with the public authorities and the big companies in order to start to develop these links in a sort of Porter type sense with the clusters, or developing a cluster of suppliers, which once they've got to a certain scale, they can then start to address international markets, but they have to reach a sufficient scale and technical capacity before they start jumping off. It's that jumping off point that they can't get to. So we all know that they've got to export and look at national markets, but you've got to get them to a level where they can actually move there. Good example is Taiwan, that got its small business sector through an enormous amount of programs which built their capacity, and then they got to a stage where they internationalized. The key is getting them to that stage, and that's where I think all these institutional assets that we've talked about are really so important. So I see, as I said, I see elements that they've built the institutional assets that are required to develop the economy. They've made some progress so far, and I think that's very good, and there's a lot more to come in future, I think. So I think hope I've answered that.
Very much so. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we could go on with this because it's very interesting. You are all invited to have a glass of wine. I think probably in the kitchen afterwards, or maybe here.
Or the next room.
Not sure. Kitchen. So just to finally say thank you very much. I think we've had some really incredibly high quality interventions today. I'm absolutely stimulated. Let's stay in touch and keep this conversation going. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for coming, and thank you to you for coming as well.